The autumn wind swept across the grounds of Thornfield Palace, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the weight of unspoken tensions. Prince Charles Ashworth stood at the grand window of his private study, watching as the morning mist clung to the ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of royal secrets. At 55, his face bore the lines of a man who had carried the burden of duty since birth, yet his eyes still held a spark of the dreamer he had once been. The knock at his door came precisely at 9 o'clock, as it had every morning for the past 7 years. Lady Camilla Harrington entered without waiting for permission, her burgundy silk dress rustling against the marble floor. She moved with the practiced grace of a woman born into nobility, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. In her hands, she carried the morning correspondence and the day's schedule, as she had done countless times before. "Your Highness," she said, her voice carrying the familiar warmth that had comforted him through his darkest moments. "The Prime Minister wishes to discuss the upcoming trade negotiations, and your mother requests your presence at the Charity Gala Planning Committee this afternoon." Charles turned from the window, offering her a smile that had grown increasingly mechanical over the months. Camilla had been his confidant, his anchor in the storm of royal politics, and, for a brief time, something more. Their relationship had blossomed from friendship into romance during the difficult period following his divorce, when the press had torn apart every aspect of his personal life. She had understood the weight of his position, the loneliness that came with the crown he would one day wear. "Of course," he replied, accepting the papers she offered. Their fingers brushed momentarily, and he noticed how she lingered, searching his face for something that was no longer there. "Camilla, we need to discuss the photographer's visit next week. The palace wants new official portraits." She nodded, though something flickered in her pale blue eyes. "I've already made the arrangements. The photographer comes highly recommended. A young woman named Catherine Middleton. Her work with the previous royal sessions has been quite remarkable." The name meant nothing to Charles at that moment, just another appointment in the endless calendar of royal obligations. He had long since learned to compartmentalize his life into segments of duty, each requiring a different version of himself. The public Charles, the private Charles, the son, the future king, all carefully constructed personas that protected the real man hidden beneath layers of protocol and expectation. As Camilla began reviewing the week's schedule, Charles found his attention drifting back to the window. The mist was beginning to clear, revealing the sprawling gardens that his grandmother had designed decades ago. Somewhere among those hedgerows and flower beds, gardeners were preparing the grounds for winter, cutting back the roses that had bloomed so magnificently through the summer. It struck him as oddly metaphorical, the necessity of pruning away the beautiful to make room for new growth. "Are you listening, Charles?" Camilla's voice carried a note of gentle reproach that had become more frequent lately. He turned back to her, noting how the morning light caught the worry lines around her eyes. "Forgive me. I was thinking about the roses." "The roses?" She followed his gaze to the window, then back to his face. "You've seemed distant lately. Is everything all right?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither quite knew how to cross. How could he explain the growing sense of restlessness that had been consuming him? How could he tell her that their comfortable routine had begun to feel like a beautiful prison? Camilla deserved better than half-truths, but the whole truth felt too dangerous to voice. "I'm fine," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Just the usual pressures." She studied him for a long moment, her intuition clearly telling her otherwise. As a woman who had navigated court politics for most of her adult life, Camilla could read the subtle signs of emotional withdrawal. She had seen this pattern before in other relationships, the gradual pulling away that preceded either honest conversation or inevitable ending. "The photographer session is scheduled for Thursday morning," she said, returning to safer ground. "Light should be optimal in the blue room around 10 o'clock. "Thursday," Charles repeated, making a mental note. "What did you say her name was again?" "Catherine Middleton. Kate, I believe she prefers. She's quite young, but her portfolio is impressive. She has a way of capturing something authentic in her subjects, something beyond the formal poses we're used to." Charles nodded absently, his mind already moving to other matters. The morning meeting with his private secretary would cover the week's public appearances, including a hospital opening and a veterans ceremony. Then, lunch with several MPs about the environmental initiative he'd been championing. The afternoon would be consumed by paperwork and phone calls to various heads of state. As Camilla gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Charles, if you ever want to talk about anything, I hope you know that I'm here." The sincerity in her voice made him look up from the correspondence he'd already begun reading. For a moment, he saw not the efficient royal aide or the sophisticated woman who graced state dinners with such elegance, but the friend who had held him together during some of his worst moments. The woman who had loved him without expectation of reward, who had asked for nothing but his happiness in return. "I know," he said softly. "Thank you, Camilla." After she left, Charles remained at his desk for several minutes, staring at the closed door. Outside, he could hear the distant sounds of the palace coming to life. Servants beginning their daily routines, guards changing shifts, the gentle hum of an institution that had operated with clockwork precision for generations. It was a symphony he knew by heart, yet lately it had begun to sound less like music and more like the ticking of an enormous clock, marking time until something indefinable would change forever. He picked up his pen and began reviewing the trade agreements that required his attention, but his mind kept wandering to the upcoming photography session. There was something about new faces, new perspectives, that always intrigued him. Perhaps it was the artist in him, the part of his personality that had been carefully managed and controlled since childhood, but never quite extinguished. The morning passed in its usual blur of meetings and decisions. By noon, Charles had approved 3 state initiatives, declined 2 interview requests, and reviewed the guest list for an upcoming diplomatic dinner. Each task required his complete attention, yet he moved through them with the automatic efficiency of long practice. It wasn't until he was walking through the portrait gallery on his way to lunch that he paused to really look at the paintings surrounding him. Generations of his ancestors gazed down from ornate frames, their faces captured at moments of triumph, contemplation, or simply formal obligation. How many of them had felt the weight of duty pressing down like a physical force? How many had wondered if there might be something more beyond the confines of protocol and expectation? His footsteps echoed in the long hallway as he continued toward the dining room, where Camilla would be waiting with the afternoon's agenda. She would smile and make pleasant conversation while they ate, discussing everything and nothing, maintaining the careful balance they had established over months of gradually shifting dynamics. But something was changing, had been changing for weeks now, though he couldn't quite name what it was. Perhaps it was simply the natural evolution of their relationship, the way that passionate intensity sometimes mellowed into comfortable companionship. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that comfort, while valuable, was not the same thing as completeness. The dining room, with its ancient tapestries and gleaming silver, welcomed him with familiar grandeur. Camilla was already seated, reviewing notes for the charity gala, her reading glasses perched on her nose in a way that made her look both scholarly and elegant. She looked up as he entered, offering the warm smile that had once made his heart race, but now simply made him feel grateful for her presence in his complicated life. As they began their lunch, discussing the various personalities and politics involved in the upcoming gala, Charles found himself wondering what Thursday would bring. New portraits meant new ways of seeing himself, new interpretations of who he was meant to be. The young photographer, Kate, wasn't it, would bring her own vision to the process, her own way of seeing beyond the titles and expectations to whatever truth lay underneath. He had no way of knowing, as he sat there making pleasant conversation with Camilla about flower arrangements and seating charts, that Thursday would mark the beginning of something that would change everything he thought he knew about duty, love, and the courage required to choose between them. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem more vivid, as if the world had been washed clean overnight. Catherine Middleton stood outside the towering gates of Thornfield Palace, her camera equipment carefully arranged in professional cases, her heart beating with the nervous excitement that always accompanied significant assignments. At 28, she had already built a reputation as one of the most promising portrait photographers in the country, but this was her first royal commission. The palace grounds stretched before her like something from a fairy tale, all manicured lawns and ancient stone, with towers that pierced the morning sky like exclamation points against the clouds. As she was escorted through endless corridors lined with priceless artwork, Kate found herself trying to imagine what it would be like to call such a place home, to wake each morning surrounded by centuries of history and expectation. The blue room had been chosen for its natural lighting, tall windows facing east to catch the gentle morning sun. As Kate began setting up her equipment, she took careful note of the room's character, the way the light played across the silk wallpaper, how the antique furniture created intimate spaces within the grand proportions, where shadows fell and highlights danced. Every portrait told a story, and she wanted to understand the setting before she met her subject. Lady Camilla Harrington appeared first, her manner professional but warm as she reviewed the schedule and discussed the palace's requirements for the photographs. She spoke with the authority of someone completely comfortable in this rarefied environment, yet Kate noticed something else in her demeanor, a subtle tension, as if she was performing a role that had recently become slightly ill-fitting. His Highness prefers natural poses to overly formal ones, Camilla explained, straightening an already perfect cushion on a nearby chair. He finds the traditional royal portraits rather stifling. Kate nodded, adjusting her camera settings as she listened. I always try to capture something authentic. The formal shots have their place, but the best portraits reveal something true about the person beneath the title. Something in Camilla's expression shifted at those words, a fleeting vulnerability that she quickly masked. Yes, I imagine that must be challenging with someone in his position. There are so many layers to navigate. Before Kate could respond, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Camilla immediately straightened, her public demeanor sliding into place like armor, and Kate found herself unconsciously checking her own appearance in the reflection of her camera lens. Prince Charles entered the room with the easy confidence of a man who had been photographed thousands of times, yet Kate noticed that his eyes took in every detail of her setup with genuine curiosity rather than resigned duty. He was taller than she had expected, and when he smiled in greeting, the warmth reached his eyes in a way that made her realize how rarely that happened in most royal photographs. Miss Middleton, I presume? His voice carried the cultured accent she had expected, but there was something more approachable in his tone than she had imagined. I understand you're going to make me look younger and more intelligent than I actually am. The unexpected humor caught her off guard, and she found herself laughing genuinely. I prefer to work with what I'm given, Your Highness, though I promise to be kind with the lighting. As they began the formal introduction and discussion of what the palace hoped to achieve with the new portraits, Kate became aware of an interesting dynamic in the room. Camilla remained present, offering suggestions and maintaining her role as facilitator, but Kate noticed how Charles's attention seemed to sharpen when Kate spoke, how his responses became more animated and less automatically polite. I thought we might start with some traditional poses, Kate said, indicating the chair that had been positioned near the windows. Then, perhaps move to something more relaxed if you're comfortable with that approach. Charles settled into the designated spot with practiced ease, but Kate could see the subtle way his shoulders tensed, how his expression settled into the familiar mask of royal composure. Through her camera lens, she watched him transform into the figure the public knew. Dignified, slightly distant, perfectly controlled. That's technically perfect, she said after taking several shots. But I wonder if we might try something different. She lowered her camera and stepped closer, studying the way the light fell across his features. Would you mind if I adjusted your position slightly? I think the light might be more flattering if you turned just a bit toward the window. As she moved to demonstrate the angle she had in mind, their eyes met directly for the first time. The jolt of connection was unexpected and immediate, not the formal acknowledgement between photographer and subject, but something more personal and startling. For a moment, neither moved, caught in a bubble of suspended time where the elaborate protocol of their respective roles seemed suddenly irrelevant. Kate was the first to look away, stepping back with professional composure, but her hands trembled slightly as she returned to her camera. She had photographed celebrities, politicians, even other members of the nobility, but had never experienced anything like the electric awareness that had just passed between them. From her position near the fireplace, Camilla had witnessed the entire exchange. Years of reading court politics had made her sensitive to the smallest shifts in interpersonal dynamics, and what she had just observed sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She had seen Charles interact with countless people in countless situations, but never with quite that quality of immediate attention, that spark of genuine interest that went far beyond polite engagement. Perhaps we should try a few shots with you standing, Kate suggested, her voice carefully professional despite the unusual flutter in her chest. The natural light by the window is really beautiful right now. Charles moved to the suggested position, but something had changed in his demeanor. The automatic royal composure had been replaced by something more alert and present. When Kate began taking pictures again, she found herself capturing expressions she hadn't seen in any of his previous formal portraits. Moments of genuine thoughtfulness, traces of humor, glimpses of the man rather than just the prince. "You're very good at this," he commented during a brief pause while she changed lenses. "Most photographers seem to want me to look either inspirational or intimidatingly regal. You're capturing something different." "I'm interested in authenticity," Kate replied, not looking up from her equipment. "Anyone can point a camera at a crown or a title. The challenge is finding the person underneath." The conversation continued as they worked, moving gradually away from the stilted politeness of formal introductions towards something more natural and engaging. Charles asked about her background, her training, her philosophy about photography. Kate found herself sharing insights about her work that she rarely discussed, explaining how she tried to create a connection with her subjects that went beyond the surface of their public personas. What struck her most was how intently he listened. Not the polite attention that important people often displayed while their minds were clearly elsewhere, but genuine engagement with what she was saying. His questions were thoughtful, revealing an understanding of artistic process that surprised her. "I studied art history at university," he explained when she commented on his perceptive observations. "I've always been fascinated by how artists reveal truth through their work. Photography, painting, sculpture, they all have the power to show us things about ourselves that we might not otherwise see." As the session progressed, Camilla found herself becoming increasingly uncomfortable with what she was witnessing. The professional consultation she had expected had transformed into something that looked disturbingly like a personal conversation between two people discovering unexpected common ground. She cleared her throat gently, drawing their attention back to the business at hand. "We should probably move to the outdoor shots soon," she suggested. "The light will change if we wait much longer." The reminder of time and schedule brought a subtle shift back toward formality, but the connection that had been established didn't disappear entirely. As they moved outside to the palace gardens, Kate found herself seeing the familiar grounds through new eyes, imagining how they might serve as backdrop for portraits that captured not just royal dignity but human warmth. The garden session proved even more revealing than the indoor photographs. Away from the formal constraints of the Blue Room, Charles seemed to relax further, his conversation becoming more animated as he pointed out particular features of the landscape, sharing stories about the garden's history and his own connection to this place where he had grown up. Kate captured him in moments of unguarded expression, pointing out a particularly beautiful section of the rose garden, laughing at a story he was telling about his childhood adventures in these very walkways, pausing to examine a late-blooming flower with the focused attention of someone who found genuine pleasure in such simple observations. "These are going to be wonderful," she told him honestly as they concluded the outdoor portion of the session. "You have a very expressive face when you're not thinking about being photographed." The compliment seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment she saw something vulnerable in his expression, as if no one had told him such a thing in a very long time. The brief glimpse of uncertainty made him seem younger, more approachable, infinitely more human than the careful public figure she had expected to meet. As they walked back toward the palace, Camilla rejoined them after having given them space during the garden shoot. Kate noticed immediately how Charles's demeanor shifted slightly in her presence, not becoming less warm, but taking on a different quality, as if he was consciously returning to a familiar dynamic that required a particular version of himself. "I think we have everything we need for now," Kate said as they reached the entrance. "I'll have the proofs ready for review by early next week." "I look forward to seeing them," Charles replied, and there was something in his tone that made it clear he meant more than just the photographs themselves. As Kate packed her equipment, she was acutely aware of the conversation taking place nearby between Charles and Camilla, professional discussion about the rest of his day, the evening's commitments, tomorrow's schedule. But beneath the practical details, she could sense an undercurrent of something else, a tension that hadn't been there at the beginning of the morning. When it came time to leave, Charles walked with her to the main entrance, a courtesy that seemed to surprise the palace staff. As they said goodbye, their handshake lasted perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, and Kate found herself wondering if he had felt the same electric jolt of connection that had taken her so completely by surprise. "Thank you for an exceptional morning, Miss Middleton," he said formally, but his eyes held something warmer and more personal. "I hope we'll have occasion to work together again soon." As Kate was escorted back through the palace corridors and out to the main gates, she carried with her more than just exposed film and professional satisfaction. Something had shifted during those few hours. Some perception of what was possible had been quietly but fundamentally altered. She had arrived that morning prepared to photograph a prince. She was leaving with the memory of meeting a man whose complexity and depth had taken her completely by surprise. Behind the palace walls, Charles stood at the window of his study, watching her car disappear down the long drive. Camilla had returned to her office to attend to the day's correspondence, but not before he had caught the questions in her eyes, the subtle concern that she was too sophisticated to voice directly but too intuitive to entirely conceal. For the first time in months, Charles found himself genuinely looking forward to something, not because duty required it, but because his own curiosity had been awakened by a young woman with a camera who saw past titles and protocol to whatever lay beneath. The realization both thrilled and terrified him in ways he wasn't yet prepared to fully acknowledge. The proof sheets arrived at Thornfield Palace on a gray Monday morning, delivered in a discreet portfolio that bore only Kate's professional monogram. Charles had been expecting them, yet when Camilla placed the package on his desk during their morning meeting, he felt his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with professional curiosity about royal portraits. "Miss Middleton's work," Camilla said, her voice carrying the neutral tone she had perfected over years of court protocol. She included a note saying she was very pleased with the results. Charles opened the portfolio with carefully controlled movements, aware that Camilla was watching his reaction. The first image took his breath away, not because of technical excellence, though that was evident, but because he hardly recognized himself. The man in the photograph looked alive in a way that seemed foreign after years of formal royal portraits. His eyes held warmth and intelligence, his expression suggesting someone actively engaged with the world rather than merely enduring his responsibilities within it. "These are quite different," he said, flipping through the contact sheets with growing amazement. Each photograph revealed something new, moments of genuine laughter captured during their garden walk, thoughtful expressions as he had discussed the history of the palace grounds, even shots where he appeared to be listening with real interest rather than polite attention. Camilla moved closer to examine the photographs over his shoulder, and he felt her stillness as she processed what she was seeing. These weren't the controlled, dignified portraits that usually emerged from royal photography sessions. These were intimate glimpses of a man she thought she knew completely, yet who appeared somehow transformed through another woman's lens. "She has real talent," Camilla acknowledged, though Charles caught the slight tightness in her voice. "Though some of these might be considered too informal for official use." Charles continued studying the images, particularly one taken in the rose garden where he appeared to be mid-conversation, his face animated with enthusiasm about something he was explaining. He could remember the exact moment. Kate had asked about his environmental initiatives, and he had found himself talking passionately about sustainable agriculture, forgetting entirely about Royal Reserve in his excitement to share ideas with someone who seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts rather than simply his position. "I think they're perfect," he said quietly. "For the first time, I actually look like myself." The comment hung between them with more weight than either had anticipated. Camilla had spent years helping Charles navigate the careful balance between personal authenticity and royal duty, but she had never heard him suggest that previous official portraits had failed to capture his true self. The implication that this young photographer had succeeded where others had failed sent an uncomfortable chill through her that had nothing to do with the late autumn weather. "There's also this," Camilla said, producing a handwritten note that had accompanied the photographs. "Miss Middleton asks if you would be available for a brief follow-up session. She mentions having some additional ideas for outdoor shots that might complement the formal portraits." Charles read the note twice, his attention lingering on Kate's graceful handwriting and the enthusiastic tone of her professional observations. She had written about light and composition, about capturing the authentic personality behind the public figure, about her excitement at working with such an engaging subject. The language was professional, but there was something personal in the way she expressed her artistic vision that made his heart rate increase. "When might such a session be possible?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Camilla consulted her ever-present calendar, though Charles suspected she already knew his schedule by heart. "You have a free afternoon on Wednesday, though we should probably discuss whether additional photographs are really necessary." These seemed quite comprehensive. The suggestion that further sessions might be superfluous struck Charles as reasonable from a practical standpoint, yet the thought of not seeing Kate again felt unexpectedly disappointing. Since Thursday's photography session, he had found himself thinking about their conversation with surprising frequency. Her insights about art and authenticity, the way she had laughed at his unexpected humor, the intelligence that had sparked in her eyes when they discussed topics that genuinely interested him. "I think one more session would be valuable," he said, making his decision. Miss Middleton clearly has a unique perspective, and the palace could benefit from having a complete range of portrait options available. As Camilla made notes about scheduling, Charles returned his attention to the photographs. One image in particular caught his eye, a candid shot taken as Kate had been explaining something about camera angles. He was looking directly at her with an expression of focused attention that seemed to reveal more about his state of mind than he was entirely comfortable acknowledging. In that frozen moment, captured without his awareness, he looked like a man discovering something unexpectedly fascinating. The realization troubled and intrigued him in equal measure. When was the last time he had looked at anyone with such unguarded interest? When had he last felt genuinely curious about another person's thoughts and experiences rather than simply performing his role in an endless series of social and professional interactions? Charles, Camilla's voice drew him back to the present. Is everything all right? You seem quite absorbed in those photographs. He looked up to find her studying his face with the same careful attention she usually reserved for reading complex political situations. As a woman who had navigated court intrigue for decades, Camilla possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect subtle shifts in mood and motivation. What she was seeing in his expression clearly concerned her. They're just very well done, he said, closing the portfolio. Miss Middleton has captured something I haven't seen in royal portraits before. What exactly? Camilla's question carried more weight than casual curiosity. Charles considered his response carefully. How could he explain that for the first time in years, he had looked at photographs of himself and seen not just the prince performing his duties, but glimpses of the man he might be if circumstances were different? How could he articulate the strange liberation he had felt during those hours with Kate, when conversation had flowed naturally without the careful calculations that usually governed his interactions? Authenticity, he said finally. She's managed to capture something genuine. Camilla nodded, but he caught the flicker of something else in her expression. Not jealousy exactly, but a kind of protective concern that suggested she understood the implications of what he was saying better than he did himself. The rest of their morning meeting proceeded with its usual efficiency. Review of correspondence, discussion of upcoming public appearances, coordination of various charitable and state obligations. But beneath the familiar routine, both were aware of something that had shifted. The photographs had revealed not just Charles's image, but something about his state of mind that neither had fully recognized before. After Camilla left to attend to other duties, Charles found himself returning repeatedly to the portfolio. Each viewing revealed new details: the relaxed set of his shoulders in the informal shots, the genuine warmth in his smile during their garden conversation, the alert intelligence in his expression when Kate had challenged his assumptions about contemporary art. But it was more than just seeing himself differently. The photographs reminded him of the experience itself, the unexpected pleasure of talking with someone who asked thoughtful questions and listened to his answers with genuine interest rather than deference. Kate had treated him as an equal in intellectual discourse, challenging his ideas respectfully but directly, sharing her own perspectives with a confidence that suggested she valued their exchange as much as the professional opportunity. When had he last experienced that kind of stimulating conversation? When had someone last made him laugh spontaneously or encouraged him to articulate ideas that he rarely had occasion to explore? The realization that such simple human connection had become so rare in his life was both sobering and energizing. By afternoon, Charles found himself looking forward to Wednesday with an anticipation that went far beyond professional interest in additional portraits. The prospect of spending more time with Kate, of continuing conversations that had been cut short by scheduling constraints, filled him with an energy he hadn't felt in months. He was reviewing state papers in his study when Camilla returned with additional correspondence, but his concentration kept drifting to the portfolio that lay closed on the side table. Finally, he set aside the documents he had been reading and looked up at her directly. "Camilla, may I ask you something?" She settled into the chair across from his desk, giving him her complete attention. "Of course. Do you think I've become boring?" The question clearly surprised her. "Boring? Charles, what brought this on?" He gestured toward the photographs. "Looking at these, I realized I can't remember the last time I had a conversation that felt alive. Everything is so carefully managed, so controlled. Even our personal interactions have become predictable." Camilla was quiet for a long moment, and he could see her considering not just his question, but what had prompted it. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness that caught him off guard. "I think you've become careful," she said, "which is understandable, given the scrutiny you live under. But careful and boring aren't the same thing. Aren't they? Charles stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where he and Kate had walked just days before. When did I stop saying things that weren't calculated? When did I stop being curious about people beyond what they could offer the crown? Is this about the photography session? Camilla's question was gentle but direct. Charles considered lying, offering some deflection about artistic inspiration or professional obligations. But Camilla deserved better than that, and perhaps he needed to acknowledge what was happening if he was going to understand it himself. Partly, he admitted. Miss Middleton asked me questions I haven't been asked in years. She listened to my answers as if my thoughts mattered beyond their political implications. It was refreshing. Refreshing. Camilla repeated the word quietly, as if testing its weight. She made me remember that I have opinions about things other than state policy. Ideas that I've developed not because they serve the crown, but because they interest me personally. He turned back to face her. When did I stop being a person who could engage with the world on those terms? Camilla's expression was carefully controlled, but he could see the effort it required. As someone who had sacrificed her own spontaneity to the demands of royal protocol, she understood exactly what he was describing. The price of their position was often the gradual erosion of authentic selfhood, replaced by carefully constructed personas designed to serve larger purposes. Perhaps, she said carefully, the question isn't when you stopped being that person, but whether you want to become him again. The observation struck him as both insightful and slightly dangerous. To reclaim authentic selfhood would require dismantling some of the protective structures they had built around their relationship, around his role, around the careful balance of duty and personal fulfillment that governed his life. It would mean acknowledging desires and possibilities that had been suppressed in service of stability and appropriate behavior. Wednesday's session, he said finally. I'd like to approach it differently. Less formal structure, more opportunity for natural conversation. Camilla nodded, though he noticed how her hands tightened slightly on the arms of her chair. Of course, I'll make sure Miss Middleton understands that you're interested in a more relaxed approach. As they returned to the afternoon's business, both were aware that something fundamental had been acknowledged but not yet fully explored. The photographs had revealed more than Charles's image. They had illuminated the gap between who he had become and who he might still be capable of being. That evening, as Charles reviewed his correspondence alone in his study, he found himself thinking not about state affairs or royal obligations, but about the prospect of Wednesday afternoon. For the first time in months, he was looking forward to something not because duty required it, but because his own curiosity had been awakened by a young woman who saw past his title to whatever authentic self remained underneath. The realization both thrilled and terrified him, suggesting possibilities that could change everything about the carefully ordered life he had built with Camilla and the future they had planned together. Wednesday arrived with an unseasonable warmth that had coaxed the last roses in the palace gardens to bloom despite the advancing autumn. Charles found himself at his study window again, watching for Kate's arrival with an anticipation that felt both familiar and completely foreign. This was not the dutiful readiness he brought to most appointments, but something more personal, the nervous energy of someone about to spend time with a person who intrigued him. Camilla had been noticeably quiet during their morning meeting, conducting palace business with her usual efficiency, but lacking the comfortable warmth that typically characterized their interactions. When she mentioned Kate's upcoming arrival, her voice carried a professional distance that hadn't been there before, as if she was deliberately creating space between herself and whatever was about to unfold. Miss Middleton requested permission to photograph in the private gardens behind the East Wing, Camilla reported, consulting her notes. She mentioned something about capturing you in a more natural environment. The suggestion of the private gardens surprised Charles. That section of the palace grounds was rarely accessed by anyone outside the immediate royal family, a sanctuary where he could walk without the constant awareness of being observed and evaluated. That Kate had specifically requested such an intimate setting suggested she understood something about what he needed from this session that went beyond professional photography. That sounds perfect, he said, though he noticed Camilla's slight frown at his enthusiasm. When Kate arrived, Charles was struck again by how her presence seemed to alter the atmosphere around her. She moved through the formal palace corridors with respectful awareness of their grandeur, yet without the intimidation that most people displayed in such surroundings. Her confidence was quiet, but unmistakable, suggesting someone completely comfortable with her own capabilities and vision. Your Highness, she greeted him with a smile that was both professional and genuinely warm. Thank you for making time for this additional session. I have some ideas that I think will create beautiful companion pieces to last week's portraits. As she spoke, Charles found himself studying her face with an attention that would have been inappropriate if she had noticed. There was something about her expressions that fascinated him. The way her eyes lit up when she discussed her artistic vision, how her features became animated with enthusiasm for her work. She possessed an authenticity that felt rare in his experience, a quality of being completely present and engaged with whatever held her attention. Camilla remained with them as they walked toward the East Gardens, maintaining her role as facilitator and chaperone, but Charles was acutely aware of the tension in her posture. She participated in the conversation about lighting and locations, but he caught her studying both him and Kate with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a developing situation that concerned her. The private gardens were at their most beautiful in the afternoon light, with the autumn sun casting golden shadows through the mature trees and highlighting the architectural details of the hidden alcoves and pathways that Charles had explored as a child. As Kate began setting up her equipment, she moved through the space with the sure instincts of an artist who understood how environment could serve her vision. "This is extraordinary," she said, adjusting her camera settings while surveying the garden's possibilities. "It feels completely different from the formal areas of the palace. More personal, somehow." "It is personal," Charles replied. "This is where I came as a boy when I needed to think, or when the weight of everything else became too much. My grandmother designed these gardens as a retreat from the public aspects of royal life." Kate paused in her preparations, looking at him with new understanding. "Then, this is where we need to capture you. Not as the prince performing his duties, but as the man who still comes here when he needs sanctuary." The perceptiveness of her observation caught him off guard. How had she understood so quickly what this place meant to him? How had she recognized that he still sought refuge here, still found peace among these carefully tended pathways when the demands of his position became overwhelming? "Camilla," Charles said, making a sudden decision, "would you mind giving us some time to work? I think the photographs might be more natural without an audience." The request hung in the air with more significance than its simple words suggested. Camilla's eyes moved between Charles and Kate, and he could see her processing the implications of what he was asking. To leave them alone together would be a departure from normal protocol. But, more than that, it would be acknowledgement that something was happening here that required privacy to fully develop. "Of course," Camilla said, her voice carefully neutral. "I'll be in my office if you need anything." As she walked away, Charles felt both relief and a twinge of guilt. He valued Camilla's presence in his life, appreciated the stability and understanding she brought to his world, but he also recognized that what was unfolding with Kate required space to breathe and grow without the weight of existing relationships pressing down upon it. "Shall we begin?" Kate asked, and there was something different in her voice now that they were alone, not more intimate exactly, but more direct, as if she too had felt constrained by the formal structure of their previous interactions. The photography session that followed was unlike anything Charles had experienced. Kate guided him through the garden spaces with an intuitive understanding of how his relationship to the environment could be captured through her lens. She photographed him beside the fountain where he had spent countless hours reading as a teenager, walking along the path where he still came to think through difficult decisions, standing beneath the ancient oak tree that had witnessed decades of his private moments. But, more than just photographing him, she talked with him. Their conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic: art and literature, environmental conservation, the challenges of balancing personal convictions with public responsibility. Kate asked questions that revealed genuine curiosity about his thoughts and experiences, and she shared her own perspectives with a candor that suggested she saw him as an equal in intellectual discourse rather than simply a subject to be professionally managed. "You mentioned studying art history," she said as they moved to a secluded bench surrounded by late-blooming roses. "Do you still paint? Draw? Create anything for yourself?" The question touched on something he rarely discussed, a part of himself that had been gradually pushed aside by the demands of royal duties. "I used to watercolor," he admitted. "Landscapes mostly. I haven't had time for it in years." "That's a shame," Kate said, adjusting her camera angle to capture him against the backdrop of roses. "Artistic expression is so important for understanding ourselves. When we create, we reveal things about how we see the world that we might not even realize consciously." As she spoke, Charles found himself remembering the satisfaction he had once found in mixing colors, in trying to capture on paper the subtle variations of light and shadow that changed throughout the day in these very gardens. When had he stopped making time for such personal pursuits? When had creativity become a luxury he could no longer afford? Perhaps I should take it up again, he said, surprising himself with the admission. You should, Kate replied emphatically, and the encouragement in her voice made something in his chest tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. Creativity feeds the soul in ways that duty alone never can. The conversation continued as they moved through different areas of the garden, with Kate capturing not just images, but moments of genuine connection. Charles found himself sharing thoughts and observations that he rarely expressed to anyone, drawn out by her obvious interest and the non-judgmental way she received whatever he chose to reveal. You're very easy to talk to, he told her as they paused near a secluded arbor where climbing roses created a natural canopy. Most people seem more interested in agreeing with me than actually engaging with my ideas. Kate lowered her camera and looked at him directly. That must be terribly lonely. The simple observation, spoken with such straightforward compassion, hit him with unexpected force. Yes, it was lonely. The constant performance of being royal, the careful management of every interaction to serve larger purposes, the way people reflected back to him only what they thought he wanted to see. It had created an isolation that he had learned to accept but never fully acknowledged. It can be, he said quietly, though I've grown accustomed to it. Accustomed isn't the same as accepting, Kate said. And acceptance isn't the same as being happy about it. As the afternoon progressed, Charles became increasingly aware that what was happening between them went far beyond professional photography. There was an intimacy developing in their conversation, a sense of mutual recognition that felt both natural and dangerous. Kate saw him clearly, not the prince performing his role, but the man underneath who still harbored dreams and doubts, who still needed connection and understanding like any human being. When Kate suggested they conclude the session with some photographs by the garden's most private area, a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees where even the palace staff rarely ventured, Charles agreed without hesitation. As they walked deeper into the garden's sanctuary, he found himself wondering what would happen when this afternoon ended, when they returned to the formal boundaries that typically governed his interactions with people outside his immediate circle. This is perfect, Kate said, examining the way the late afternoon light filtered through the canopy of leaves. The lighting is magical here. As she began taking what would be their final photographs, Charles realized that something fundamental had shifted during these hours together. Kate had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, not just romantic interest, though that was certainly present, but a broader sense of possibility about who he might be and how he might connect with the world. Kate, he said as she was packing away her equipment, I want you to know that this has been extraordinary. Not just the photography, but the conversation, the connection. I can't remember the last time I felt so much like myself. She looked up from her camera bag, and he saw something in her expression that mirrored his own confusion and growing attraction. I feel it too, she said simply. Whatever this is. They stood facing each other in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the private beauty of the garden that had sheltered his childhood dreams and adult contemplations. The air between them hummed with possibility and complication, with the recognition that what had begun as a professional assignment had evolved into something that could change everything. What happens now? Kate asked, voicing the question that hung unspoken between them. Charles considered the weight of that question, the implications for his relationship with Camilla, for his carefully constructed life, for the delicate balance of duty and personal fulfillment that he had spent years perfecting. But, looking at Kate, seeing the openness and courage in her expression, he realized that some possibilities were too precious to sacrifice to convenience or convention. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'd like to find out. As they walked back toward the palace in comfortable silence, both were aware that they were leaving the sanctuary of the private garden and returning to a world where their growing connection would have to be navigated carefully. But something had been acknowledged between them that could not be taken back, a recognition of mutual attraction and compatibility that promised to complicate everything they thought they knew about their respective futures. In her office, Camilla waited for their return with growing apprehension, knowing instinctively that the man who came back would be somehow different from the one who had left, and that the comfortable life they had built together was about to face its greatest test. The morning after the second photography session dawned gray and cold, as if the weather itself was reflecting the weight of unspoken truths that had settled over Thornfield Palace like a heavy blanket. Charles stood at his study window, watching the first frost of autumn silver the garden paths where he and Kate had walked just hours before, their conversation still echoing in his mind with startling clarity. He had slept poorly, his thoughts cycling between the memory of Kate's direct gaze and the growing awareness that his feelings for her represented more than simple attraction. There was something about their connection that felt inevitable, as if all the careful compromises and dutiful choices of his adult life had been leading to this moment of recognition. Yet with that recognition came the terrible weight of consequence. For Camilla, for his position, for the life he had spent years constructing around duty and appropriate expectations. The soft knock at his door came earlier than usual, and when Camilla entered, Charles immediately noticed the change in her demeanor. Gone was the warm efficiency that had characterized their morning meetings for years, replaced by a carefully neutral professionalism that felt like armor between them. "Good morning, Your Highness," she said, the formal address striking him as deliberate and significant. "The morning correspondence includes several requests for interviews about your environmental initiatives, and your mother would like to discuss the Christmas charity schedule." Charles turned from the window to study her face, noting the careful control in her expression, the way she avoided meeting his eyes directly. In all their years together, Camilla had never hidden her emotions so completely. Her transparency had been one of the qualities he most valued about their relationship, her willingness to share her thoughts and concerns, to be authentic in a world where most people told him only what they thought he wanted to hear. "Camilla," he said gently, "we should talk." She continued arranging papers on his desk with unnecessary precision. "About the charity schedule? Of course. Your mother particularly wants to ensure that the children's hospital visit receives appropriate coverage. You know that's not what I mean." Finally, she looked up at him, and he saw in her eyes the pain she had been trying so hard to conceal. It was the look of a woman who had recognized what was happening but wasn't yet ready to acknowledge it aloud, who was clinging to professional routine as a way of avoiding a conversation that would change everything between them. "Charles," she said, her voice carefully measured, "I think we should maintain our focus on your official responsibilities. There are several important events coming up that require our attention." The deflection might have worked weeks ago, before Kate's photographs had shown him a version of himself that seemed more alive and authentic than the man who had been going through the motions of royal duty. But now, after yesterday's revelations in the garden, he found he couldn't retreat into comfortable avoidance. Too much had been awakened in him to simply pretend nothing had changed. "I care about you too much to lie to you," he said, moving away from the window to sit across from her. "Something has happened, something that affects both of us, and we need to discuss it honestly." Camilla's composure cracked slightly, allowing a flash of vulnerability to show through her carefully maintained facade. "You're attracted to her." It wasn't a question, and Charles respected her too much to offer anything less than complete honesty. "Yes, but it's more than attraction. Kate sees something in me that I thought I'd lost. She makes me feel like the person I was before duty consumed everything else." The admission hung between them like a bridge that neither was sure they wanted to cross. Camilla had built her life around understanding and supporting the man Charles had become, dutiful, careful, controlled. To hear him express longing for a different version of himself was to recognize that what she offered might not be enough to hold him. "And what about us?" Camilla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about everything we've built together?" Charles felt the full weight of that question. Their relationship had been built on mutual understanding of the pressures of royal life, on shared experiences of public scrutiny and private compromise. Camilla had loved him through his worst moments, had offered stability when his world felt chaotic, had asked for nothing more than his companionship and respect. She deserved more than to be abandoned for the excitement of something new and uncertain. "What we have is real," he said carefully. "The friendship, the support, the understanding, none of that changes. But, Camilla, we both know that what's between us has become more companionate than passionate. We've been holding on to something comfortable rather than something that truly fulfills either of us." Camilla was quiet for a long moment, and Charles could see her processing not just his words but the implications behind them. As a woman who had sacrificed other possibilities for their relationship, she had to confront the reality that her loyalty and understanding might not be enough to compete with the kind of connection that Kate represented. "She's very young," Camilla said finally, and there was no jealousy in her voice, only a kind of weary recognition. "Not too young to know her own mind," Charles replied. "And not too young to see past the title to whatever authentic self still exists underneath. They sat in silence as the morning light gradually strengthened outside the windows, both aware that they were saying goodbye to more than just romantic relationship. Their partnership had encompassed professional collaboration, emotional support, and shared understanding of the unique pressures of royal life. To dissolve it would mean reimagining not just Charles's personal future, but the carefully structured world they had created together. "What will you do?" Camilla asked eventually. Charles considered the question that had been haunting him since the previous afternoon. What could he do? His position came with responsibilities and expectations that made romantic choices far more complicated than they would be for ordinary people. Yet the memory of Kate's direct gaze, her willingness to challenge his assumptions, and encourage his authentic self, made the prospect of returning to emotional numbness feel unbearable. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know I can't ignore this. Whatever is happening with Kate feels like the first genuine connection I've had in years. I need to understand what it means." Camilla nodded slowly, and Charles saw something in her expression that looked almost like relief. Perhaps she too had been aware of the gradual cooling of their relationship, the way passion had evolved into comfortable routine. Perhaps she too had been wondering if there might be something more fulfilling waiting beyond the safety of what they had built together. "I won't make this difficult for you," she said with quiet dignity. "Our friendship means too much to me to let it be destroyed by bitterness or recrimination." The grace of her response moved him deeply. Even in the face of personal disappointment, Camilla was thinking about his well-being and their shared history. It reinforced his respect for her character while also confirming his growing certainty that what they had shared was valuable but incomplete. "You deserve someone who looks at you the way I apparently look at Kate," Charles said gently. "Someone who sees you as the center of their world rather than a comfortable companion." A small smile crossed Camilla's face, the first genuine expression she had shown since entering his study. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps we've both been settling for something safe rather than something extraordinary." Over the following hours, as they worked together to address the morning's correspondence and coordinate his public obligations, Charles was struck by how naturally they had shifted into a different dynamic. The romantic tension that had been gradually fading was replaced by something cleaner and more honest, genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience rather than obligation or convenience. By afternoon, when Kate's requested follow-up appointment arrived in the form of a phone call to discuss additional portrait options, Charles felt ready to take the next step into whatever unknown territory awaited him. He took the call privately, aware that Camilla was graciously giving him space to explore this new connection without the pressure of her observation. "Miss Middleton," he said, pleased to hear her voice again so soon. "I was hoping you might call." "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Kate said, and he could hear something tentative but hopeful in her tone. "About creativity and authenticity and the importance of making time for things that feed the soul. And what conclusions have you reached?" "That life is too short to spend it pretending to be someone you're not," she said with the directness that he was learning to expect from her. "And that some connections are too rare to be sacrificed to convenience or expectation." Charles felt something in his chest tighten with emotion that was equal parts fear and exhilaration. Kate was offering him exactly what Camilla had predicted, the chance to choose extraordinary over safe, authentic over appropriate. The decision would require courage he wasn't sure he possessed, but the alternative, returning to the careful numbness of his previous existence, felt impossible now that he had experienced what genuine connection could offer. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. "Kate, would you be willing to have dinner with me? Somewhere private, where we can talk without the constraints of protocol or professional obligations." The pause that followed felt eternal, filled with all the uncertainty and possibility that such an invitation represented. When Kate finally answered, her voice was warm with the promise of everything that might unfold between them. "I'd like that very much." As Charles hung up the phone, he was aware that he had just crossed a line that would change everything about his carefully ordered life. Behind him, through the open door of his study, he could hear Camilla's voice as she coordinated his public schedule with her characteristic efficiency. She was giving him the gift of her continued friendship and professional support, even as they both acknowledged that their romantic relationship had reached its natural conclusion. Looking out at the garden where he had first begun to understand what was happening between him and Kate, Charles felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the nervous excitement of possibility, the sense that his life was about to become unpredictable and challenging, and infinitely more alive. For the first time since childhood, he was choosing personal happiness over duty, authentic connection over appropriate compromise. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. Whatever came next would require navigating uncharted territory, balancing his responsibilities to the crown with his responsibility to his own heart. But, as he began planning for an evening that might change everything, Charles knew that some risks were worth taking, and some connections too precious to sacrifice to the safer path of conventional expectation. In her office down the hall, Camilla continued her work with quiet dignity, already beginning to reimagine her own future beyond the comfortable boundaries of their shared past. She too deserved extraordinary love, and perhaps Charles's courage to pursue his authentic happiness would inspire her to seek the same for herself. The palace continued its ancient rhythms around them, but within its walls, 3 lives were being quietly revolutionized by the simple recognition that genuine connection was worth whatever disruption it might bring to their carefully constructed worlds. The moment had arrived when Charles would turn toward love and away from mere comfort, when he would choose the woman who saw his authentic self over the one who had learned to live with his careful compromises. And, in that choice, all 3 of them would discover what it meant to choose life over safety, passion over convenience, the unknown over the predictable patterns that had defined their past.